This is Professor Gavoor. We're going to cover Chapter 4 of the OpenStax textbook. And we're talking about labor and financial markets. We've been talking about supply and demand, and how does it apply then to labor and financial markets? We're going to first look at labor, then financial, and then talk about the market system as an efficient way of getting information. So people often think of supply and demand in relations to goods, but it also works in labor, such as nursing. It could work to this in teachers. You'll be driving in your car or listening to the news on the radio and hear that, there's a teacher shortage, and then 3 years later you'll find out there's a surplus of teachers. And this is all because, there's a demand for teachers or nurses, and the market, then the higher education market reacts by students enrolling in more nursing and teaching programs. And then you find out there's a surplus a few years later. And how do we come to grips? How do we model this and look at this phenomena? So there is a supply and demand for labor. The law of demand in labor markets, it's the higher the salary, or wage in a labor market, the decrease in, what decreases is the quantity of jobs being demanded by employers. So here it is, we flip-flop. The employers are the ones that are the demand for work. The lower salary price increases the quantity of demand. Now the supply are the people looking for jobs. So the higher the price for labor, the higher the quantity of people that are looking for that. The lower price of labor, the lower quantity is supplied. Equilibrium again occurs where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are equal. At the equilibrium wage, employers can find workers and workers can find jobs at that rate. So here is a market for nurses, for example. If you look at supply and demand curve. Remember, supply is the amount of people looking for work. So the higher the salary, the more people, the quantity of nurses looking for jobs or moving into nursing. The demand is like this. The higher the wage, the less people looking to hire people at those wages, at those market rates. If the wages go down, they're willing to hire more people. So if the demand curve are employers that want to hire nurses, with the supply curve of those who are qualified and willing to work as nurses at the equilibrium point E. At an above equilibrium salary of 75, you have the quantity of people looking for a job, $75,000 a year. The number of people looking for a job increases to 38,000, but the quantity of nurses demanded by the marketplace decreases to 33, so you have a surplus of nurses. Puts pressure on the price that you're paying. People are looking for jobs. They're willing to take jobs for less money. You have pressure to get back to the equilibrium point. Same thing here. If you look at below it, if you put a ceiling salary in at 60, lots of people will be looking to hire nurses at 60, but a lot of nurses don't want to work at that rate. So there's, again, if there's more jobs than people looking, there's pressure for the wages to go up to the equilibrium point. So the factors that can shift the demand curve for labor: demand for output, education and training, technology, the number of companies participating in the marketplace, government regulations, and price and availability of other inputs. Factors that can shift the supply curve of labor: a number of workers, required education, government policies. Basically, if we look at the demand, if the demand at the hospitals increases for right now, obviously in this COVID crisis, there's a demand for more medical old people. They've been talking about people that are not graduated as nurses already getting jobs, and I don't know at what wage, but the demand is high because something happened. We had an epidemic, obviously. Education and training. If nursing schools open and people want to go into nursing and they attract more students, you'll have additional labor. If you have technology, somehow changes, that enhances the way we can graduate nurses faster, or less nurses can do more good. I don't know if that really works. The number of companies that are looking to hire the labor, and government regulations, like we might use government regulations, the example I used earlier, so that students that are doing their practicum in the School of Nursing can now work as full-time nurses in this COVID crisis. And of course, the price and availability of other outputs. What shifts the supply curve? Well, the number of workers, the required education, government policies. If there's been all kinds of news that we need more nurses, and the government offers incentives for people to go into nursing, and especially, so there's been cases of some municipalities and states that are not necessarily the best, where people really want to work and live. They'll say, hey, we'll pay for your education, but you have to work here for 4 years or something like that. And to some people, that could be a great value. So how will new technologies affect the wages of high skill and low skill workers? We'll use the 4-step process of analyzing how shifts in supply and demand affect the marketplace. You can think about this, and you can actually read it in a textbook. So if we look at supply and demand, if demand for low skill labor shifts to the left when technology can do the job previously done by workers, it shifts this way. And all of a sudden, the people that will be doing their job, the quantity will be less and the wages will be less. But if new technologies can also increase the demand for high skill labor in such fields as information technology and network information, well, then the demand curve shifts to the right, and the equilibrium point goes from here to here, and both wages and the quantity of jobs required goes up. So there are such things as price floors in the labor market. A salary or wage is money paid for work or a service. Minimum wage is the price floor that makes it illegal for an employer to pay an employee less than a certain hourly wage. A living wage is something else. The amount a full-time worker would need to make and afford the essentials of life: food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare. We all know that minimum wage at $10, and if there's 2,000 working hours in a year, so at $10 an hour, that's $20,000. No one can really live on $20,000. I think it's probably borderline poverty, if not well into poverty level. So it's not a living wage. But the minimum wage at 10 is mandated, and people want to raise it to 15. Well, what will happen if we do that? Here's the economic view of this. So if you have a demand for labor and a supply of people willing to take those entry kind of level jobs, let's say it's $10 an hour. So instead of that being the minimum wage, that's actually equilibrium. And you have 1,200 workers or 1.2 million workers, or however you want to count this. If we set a price floor, and remember the price floor is above the equilibrium point, or there's no point in paying people more money. You wouldn't set the price floor below the equilibrium wage. That would be a ceiling then. Remember, the ceiling is below the equilibrium point and the floor is above. So we're not letting the wages, we're mandating the wages now have to be 12. Well, the people looking for jobs will increase because you're paying them $2 an hour more than they're currently getting, so more people are willing to do that kind of work. But the people hiring will want less. So you have an excess supply of workers than you have jobs, which means higher unemployment at that low-level wage. Now, the way many companies have solved this, and many countries around the world have this ad hoc black market solution, is almost all the first world countries have a migrant that may be documented or undocumented, but undocumented workers may be willing to work for less than $12 an hour. and therefore somehow the wages come back to the equilibrium price. We're going to have a discussion this week based on this. There's no right answer, because if you think with your heart, everybody should have a living wage. Anybody that works 40 hours a week ought to be able to live on, support themselves. Who would argue with that? Yet, the supply and demand at the lowest levels, the equilibrium is here. So if you mandate it and try to get to a higher wage with the $12 an hour, or $15 an hour, or $20 an hour, you're going to create higher unemployment at those levels. So what do? Do you let the marketplace do what the marketplace is going to do and find its equilibrium point and let things work themselves out laissez-faire? Or do you want to mandate this and create more unemployment? Now, people believe one thing or the other, and it's pretty hard to convince them. So we'll see where you stand in this discussion. And there'll be a reading from, I think it's NPR. So there's also supply and demand in financial markets. You have savings, a supply of financial capital. So people that put money into the bank. So it's a supply of financial capital. And people want to borrow against it. So there's a demand for financial capital. So financial capital is the economic resources measured in terms of money. Interest rate is the price of borrowing in a financial market. So it's the rate of return. Usury laws are laws that impose an upper limit on interest rates that lenders can charge. Unless you're a credit card company, then it seems to be no limit. And there's other companies that are called factoring entities. And this goes back to you could buy, if you had a whaling ship or a cargo ship that was being sent out, you could buy shares in the profitability of that ship's venture. And you could get different rates, and that's what factoring is. So right now, small restaurants are you have a hard time borrowing money from banks to expand their restaurant. But a factoring company will buy their, give them money to expand, but demand X percent. And it could be like 20, 25% of their net profits for like the next 3 years. And so you end up with an interest rate that's pretty high. But normally, under normal loans, there is limits set by the government. And there is limits on credit card companies, they're just much higher. So, demand and supply for borrowing money with credit cards. That's exactly what we're talking about. Here, if you had an equilibrium, in this market, credit card borrowing, the demand curve for borrowing financial capital intersects with the supply curve for lending financial capital, because if you have a credit card, someone is paying. The bank is paying. So there's a supply of financial capital. You don't have the money, but you're using your credit card to buy something. So there's people that are demanding. So based on interest rates, there's some equilibrium interest rates where people are willing to demand and people are willing to supply, and it ends up being about 15%. I think most of us are at like 19, 20% now. So what would happen? At equilibrium, the interest rate, the price in this market is 15%, and the quantity of financial capital being loaned is $600 billion. At above equilibrium, the interest rate is 21%. The quantity of financial capital supplied would be to $750 billion, but the quantity demanded would decrease to $480 billion. So we'll have an excess in money available. On the other hand, if we drop it to 13%, people would theoretically demand more. And but the banks would be willing to lend less, make less available for lend. So you'd have an excess demand or shortage of financial capital. Now, people are charging 19, 20, 21% on interest rates now. Why is there not? And a lot of people are running up their credit cards. People probably, one of the things in neoclassical economics is people are savvy and very sharp calculators and working on, in their own self-interest. Well, how does self-interest translate to someone with a credit card with a limit of $5,000 on it, for example? Well, I want a TV, I'll buy a TV. I want this, I'll buy this. I want that, I'll buy that. Next thing you know, they run their credit card up all the way to the top. And they're making minimum payments at 21%, but they have the TV, and I guess that seems to work for them. Other people will look at it. Yes, I have a credit card, but I want to pay my credit card off every month. So there will be an excess supply of money available there. Probably, I don't know what the proportions are of people that will use it and not use it. If we look at credit card interest rates, it's another pricing example. So the original intersection of demand and supply occurs at this equilibrium point. So you have a certain amount of money being lent at a certain interest rate. However, we put a price ceiling and make the rate low. Well, it's exactly what we talked about. The people wanting it, the demand for that money will increase because the rates are lower. Like right now, everybody is, because the interest rates are so low in the United States, people are refinancing their mortgages simply because. But the people willing to lend at that low interest rate, the banks and the financial institutions, are backing off. So you'll have an excess demand in people wanting that kind of credit, but there'll be a shortage in the amount of money available. So these things don't happen instantaneously either. There's some temporal factor involved here. Financial decisions across time. I mean, if we looked at the exercise that we have on the run on toilet paper, the demand for toilet paper increased quickly. But it takes time for, one, the demand to settle back, because while people's demand for, they panicked and thought they needed 2 years worth of supply, a 2-year supply of toilet paper, and went out and bought it and hoarded as much as they could. And now many stores are not letting them return it. But people's usage of the product is metered out very nicely. What happens then? The supply chain eventually catches up, and eventually means in this factor of time. And you end up with an excess amount of toilet paper in the system because of that. And then the demand will probably go even lower, shift even lower than the original demand, because people have so much inventory at home, and it will take it in a different direction. So the effect of the growing U.S. debt. So this is amazingly timely too, because I'm recording this during the COVID epidemic. We just added $6 trillion to our debt with this bailout that just passed this week. So this graph shows the demand for financial capital and supply of financial capital into the U.S. financial markets by the foreign sector before the increase in uncertainty regarding U.S. public debt. I'm not sure what year we're talking about, but here's the supply of foreign capital. Here's the demand for it within this country. And you have an equilibrium. If there's some risk involved, and the people supplying the money all of a sudden all decide that we should not offer as much money, make as much money available, the entire supply curve shifts to the left. Well, now the equilibrium point shifts up the demand curve, which did not change. So we have less people looking because the rate is higher. So the market system as an efficient mechanism for information. Well, people are looking for demand and supply models all the time. There's diagrams that we can look at that are like, okay, second fundamental diagram for this course. The first was the budgetary constraint and opportunity set model. The demand and supply curve is the next thing. It explains all existing levels of how economic events will cause changes in prices and quantity. And remember, microeconomics is, another name for it, is price theory. The horizontal axis shows the different measures of quantity, whether it's a good or a service, labor for a given job, or now financial capital that we've looked at. The vertical axis always shows the price of a good or service, the wage in the labor market, or the rate of return, like the interest rate in financial markets. Changes in demand and supply reveal themselves through consumers' and producers' behavior. Price controls may deprive everyone in the economy of this critical information. If you're trying to control the price, either you're setting an artificially high price, as in minimum wage, or an artificially low price, as in guaranteed, affordable housing. With this information, it becomes difficult for buyers and sellers to react as changes occur through the economy, because you've put an artificial floor or an artificial ceiling in place. People that argue for letting the market float say the market will eventually work out. But the interesting thing there is the time part. So you have poor people. Both cases that I use were minimum wage and affordable housing. People will do something. Changes will happen. The market will still somehow move forward. It's whether we want to intervene with price floors and price ceilings, as the case may be, or whether we want to let the market over time achieve its own goals. And that's a debate that almost has no answer. So a generic demand and supply curve. We've talked about this. Quantity is always here. Price is always here. We have a supply curve and a demand curve for whatever it is. Quantity of goods and services, that's what we covered first. But then we also could look at quantity of labor and quantity of financial capital. And that changes the nature of who's demanding and who's supplying. So you have the price, if it's a good or service. You have the wage or labor rate for the quantity of labor. And you have the rate of return or the interest rate on the quantity of financial capital. In 2010, the median salary for nurses was $64,690. As the demand for services increase, the demand shifts to the right. People are looking for more. We have an aging population. That could be the reason. So what happens? We need more nurses, and we're willing to pay more than $64 to get them. And so now we're going to pay some higher wage. At the same time, the demand for nurses increases, the supply shrinks due to the number of nurses entering retirement, and increases in tuition for nursing degrees. So the supply shifts. So now the equilibrium moves from E1 to E2. The quantity of nurses available goes down, and the wages go up further yet. So you could use this supply and demand, as we said. It's the market system. It's how to look at the market system as an efficient mechanism for information. And it is one of those fundamental curves we look at. So, and that's basically it for this chapter. Thank you very much, and we'll be talking to you again soon.